I went through all 32 NFL teams' coaches to figure out exactly how they impact your fantasy football teams. Today's episode, the Cleveland Browns. So take a seat, class is in session. First, we need to identify how this team has changed in the offseason. So we're going to start with the coaches. Have any of the coaches changed here? Looking at the defensive side of the ball, it looks like they filled the gaps that were made via free agency. But going to the offensive side of the ball, it doesn't seem like too much has changed. Honestly, it doesn't seem like they changed too many things on the offensive side of the ball. The only real addition here is Elijah Moore, and the simple fact that they're actually getting Deshaun Watson in theory for a full season. This team has more of an offensive approach to it with Kevin Stefanski and Alex Van Pelt, also known as AVP. Kevin Stefanski's knowledge is primarily shown with his time with the Vikings and now with the Browns, where AVP's is a little bit more varied. This is seen by his time with the Bills, the Bucks, the Packers, the Bengals, and now the Browns. But before we do that, we need to see exactly how the guys upstairs have the Cleveland Browns projected to go about this season to give our knowledge a little bit more structure. Cleveland Browns are currently projected to go somewhere between 9 and 10 wins. And they're currently projected to go at number 3 in the AFC North. I mean, it makes sense. But me, I'm a little bit more optimistic in where this team's going to land. I see them as potentially landing in the number 2 spot. Now we've got a really strong understanding of where the Cleveland Browns are built towards this season. We can now ultimately dive into how Kevin Stefanski and AVP affect our fantasy football teams. Just a reminder, AVP stands for Alex Van Pelt here. So starting off with the quarterback position. As we can see in the charts here, we got a little bit of a discrepancy. We got one coach that isn't the overall best with them, and then you have another that's kind of already seen the highest of highs. Just looking at the QB totals here, it's not the most optimistic thing to look at right off the bat. Stefanski's zenith is really around that 17 to 18 range, but AVP's is around 23. But looking at kind of a hybrid between the two totals here, I think a 21-point fantasy average actually makes a lot of sense here. Giving Deshaun Watson a whole offseason to work inside the system, and from my knowledge and how I'm understanding it, it seems that AVP is in full control of this offensive system. The reason I say this is because more often than not, when you hear the words coming out of Deshaun Watson's mouth, it's AVP first, then Kevin Stefanski. So to me, at least, that means we need to lean a little bit more towards AVP's side of things and towards the QB total averages. We also know how good Deshaun Watson is in fantasy. And considering he doesn't have the easiest schedule in the world, I wouldn't be surprised if we end up with some very good game scripts for Deshaun Watson here. I was letting you know a little bit about those 3 guys that I really like to be dark horse fantasy QB1s this year. Deshaun Watson fits that list. He's currently my second favorite overall because he's going as the QB8 in most fantasy football drafts. And yes, that means he's very underpriced in my personal opinion. Looking at the running back side of things, we got Nick Chubb. As we can see with both of these trends here, they're both in a general uptrend. Nick Chubb is currently going as the RB6 in most fantasy drafts, and honestly, that seems pretty fairly priced. I do believe that we're going to see a continuation of this overall uptrend, but I don't think it's going to hit that 20-plus mark. I do think we'll see him in that 18 to 19 range, making him a very top-end running back, but going with where he's at in fantasy drafts, I think he's adequately priced and realistically just a hold for me at this particular second in time. It's just with running backs, typically you have a lot more room for error, in my personal opinion, whereas receivers give you a little bit more leeway. Moving over to the RB2 spot, and that is Jerome Ford. And as you can see on the price here, in every single category, this man is underpriced. Now, I don't know if they're going to sign someone else in the offseason or what the whole shebang is here, but this could be a crazy handcuff option that no one is really buying right now, which is a little bit nutty to me. But I mean, hey, you do you, boo-boo. The weight's all on theoretically Nick Chubb's shoulders here, which means he does have a potential argument to be an RB1 this year. It is definitely in the realm of possibility. But let's say something does happen to Nick Chubb, right? What does that mean for Jerome Ford's value? I imagine they'll sign other people as well, and there's probably other people that we can think of right now, but seriously, he will likely be the number 1 option there. And you can wait to get him until the 14th round? That's a little bit ludicrous to me personally. Considering this trend is relatively flat, I think a 7 to 8 point fantasy projection makes a lot of sense here. Moving over to the wide receiver 1 and that of Amari Cooper. Both of these appear to be in uptrends to me, and it makes a lot of sense when you get a guy like Deshaun Watson back in your offense as well. If you want to have a super bearish scenario, you can go with a 15-point floor. But me, I want to say a more realistic outcome is probably a 17 fantasy point per game type of projection. Amari Cooper should be absolutely elite this year, especially since it sounds like they're not going to be getting DeAndre Hopkins added to that offense. Moving on to the wide receiver 2, it looks like we kind of got a hill and valley kind of approach here. It's hit the highest of highs, and it's also kind of hit some lows here. I think Elijah Moore is a little bit more elite than where he was being utilized in New York. Supposedly, there's a theory that the 49ers actually got better when Robert Saleh left. I'll let you determine that thought process on your own. But going with a median point off of the charts here, honestly, I think a 13 to 14 fantasy point average isn't too much to ask for here. Moving over to the wide receiver 3 here, and that is Donovan Peoples-Jones. I don't believe it's going to be Cedric Tillman, but I could be wrong. This points towards more being a downtrend more than anything to me, meaning that the wide receiver 1 and the wide receiver 2 are the ones receiving the highest level of priority. With that said, I think we can safely estimate that it's going to be about an 8 fantasy point per game average. Lastly, looking at the tight end position, and that is David Njoku. I think a 9 to 10 fantasy point average here makes a lot of sense, but isn't something I'm going to be targeting too much in drafts unless you're really trying to stack that Deshaun Watson combo in whatever way you possibly can. My biggest concern for the Browns from a fantasy perspective is primarily in week 17. We got to keep in mind that Sauce Gardner is more than likely going to completely lock down an entire side of the field, meaning that fantasy production is going to go completely out the window. And since it's on a Thursday night, I would not be surprised if this is more of a defensive battle than it's an offensive one, meaning that we're severely disappointed from a fantasy perspective. But outside of that, that's really the only downside that I'm kind of seeing. But there's also a great point that Deshaun Watson, when it comes to fantasy football, has been absolutely elite. I'm personally pretty optimistic about the Cleveland Browns in regards to fantasy football this season. I'm curious to hear your thoughts, so make sure to drop those down in the comments down below. I want to make sure to answer all of your questions as well, so make sure to please drop them down so I can go ahead and start rattling them off. If you like this content, make sure to drop a like and subscribe. We're going to be dropping a video on the Dallas Cowboys tomorrow. But in the meantime, peace.